it's Dynamite Dog Liaison, where I coach you on how to enhance your dog's mental health. And on this channel, we break down scientific research in order to inform us on how to train and educate dogs. Today, we are talking about body language. This is part one of a 4-part series. We are going to break down those stress signals, those more commonly overt ones. Some of them you probably already intuitively know a little bit, but I want to do a deep dive, and I want to make sure that you guys understand how to handle those situations, what you should do about it, what the dog is informing you with those overt signals. Now, before we jump too far in, I do want to give the disclaimer that dog body language is incredibly complicated because it is highly individual into the dog. So, just like with people, one sentence can be said the same way, and depending on the inflection, it means two different things. So you can say, go to your room, or you can say, go to your room. And depending on the inflection and depending on the context of the sentence changes its meaning. And that happens all the time with dog body language, where something will be displayed in one context and it means one thing, but you change the context and the characteristics of it completely, and the definition changes as well. Dogs are going to display stress signals at different periods of time. So, what might occur in one dog at one point could very well occur at a different phase in a different dog. And so because of these variables, it becomes very difficult for people to understand and to communicate dog body language. What I want to do is I want to talk in very general, broad terms. So I'm going to start off very scientific. I'm going to start off very objectively. I will speak to you in the way that scientists would speak about dog body language, that we describe actions, we describe specifically visible behaviors. We can say that dog is doing this. And then in the second half of this video, I will elaborate on, more contextually, more subjectively, this is what's going on, this is what this behavior means. And that subjectivity is based off of my practical experience and my formal education. So some of the more overt, obvious dog stress signals include hair up on the hackles, peeing and defecation, biting, air nipping, barking, lunging, growling, shivering, pacing, whimpering, freezing, and stiffness. These behaviors are considered going over threshold, and they usually happen as a result of adrenaline. They happen as an automatic response. There's not really a whole lot of logic or reasoning usually to these behaviors. Usually the dogs that are doing them repetitiously, usually the dogs that are continuing to growl, continuing to bite, they're doing that logically only because it is working, it is effective. The bite is resulting in whatever their accomplished goal was, and these other precursor signals that they were giving was not accomplishing their goal. Now, in the other parts of this series, we will be talking about those precursor signals that happen before these overt stress signals. But usually what ends up happening is that these overt signals are only going to be demonstrated and used by the dog if the precursor signals are ignored or misunderstood. All animal behavior happens for one of 3 reasons. That is to find and forage for food, to reproduce, and to avoid hazard, to avoid death. These stress signals are within the context of hazard avoidance. All of these behaviors are used because the dog does not want to die. The dog does not want to get into a fight. That's a huge misconception, is that aggressive dogs, as we just described, as there's no such thing as an aggressive dog, that aggressive dogs want to fight, that they're looking for an opportunity. And that's just not true. It goes against all basic common sense of evolution for animals to be constantly just picking fights willy-nilly just because they want to. That way they would always be killing each other. They would never get the opportunity to reproduce, and it's counterintuitive, counterproductive. So let's break down some of these stress signals. We want to start off with the hackles, the hair on the hackles up. This is also called piloerection, and it happens as a result of the muscles below the fur flexing. So the muscles along the spine, which are happening right below where the hair starts, is flexing and is filling up with blood and oxygen, usually as a result of adrenaline. And so all of that hair is sticking up. Peeing and defecation happens under immense amount of stress. It specifically relates to how the body shifts in an adrenaline response. So what ends up happening when norepinephrine, which is it's called adrenaline in the brain, but when that is released, the body does effectively a 180 because it wants to conserve energy. So it's going to send all of the energy, all of the preparation for this fight, flight, or freeze response, for this big traumatic event. Adrenaline turns off, it sends blood into the rest of the body, it sends oxygen through the rest of the body, it prepares the body to respond to this immediate threat. And when it does that, it has to turn off other systems. So it turns off reproduction, it turns off digestion, it turns off these other involuntary automatic responses to conserve energy to put into these other event. So what ends up happening when they pee and defecate, we think, is that the digestion system is impaired effectively, and it is not functioning, cohesively as it should. Pacing, shivering, and whimpering occur as a flight response. It tends to happen when the dog feels like he can't actually escape. He's trying to escape, but there's nowhere for him to go. Lunging seems to be a variable unique to domestication. We know that most dogs that have never been on a leash before don't typically lunge at their threat. They might charge or run, but they're not going to yank with their neck like they would on a leash. Barking, quite frankly, seems to be still a mystery as far as science is concerned. We know that dogs do it, but we also know that they do it for a lot of different reasons. There are a lot of hypotheses on this. The primary being that as we domesticated dogs and they started to evolve, becoming more intuitive to humans specifically, they needed a better outlet in order to communicate with us, and the bark seemed to be that outlet. So the barking has been proliferated and hypertrophied throughout evolution. Growling and snarling is a warning signal from the dog to the immediate threat that tension is escalating and that they are about to have to respond to the threat. Air nipping is also a warning. It's usually misconceived as a accidental bite, or like the dog was trying to bite. That doesn't necessarily usually happen. If a dog wants to bite, they bite. They use their teeth. So the fact that you just got a little air nip is really telling you that it's just a warning. If he wanted to hurt, he could have hurt. He chose not to. He didn't think he needed to take it to that step, so he was giving you another warning chance with that air nip, hopefully to prevent you from confronting him and escalating things. Now, as far as biting is concerned, I'm going to talk in very broad terms. I can't stress enough what I'm about to say is generalized. Please do not think that this immediately applies to your dog right now. It's incredibly generalized what I'm about to say, but in very broad terms, when it comes to biting, the louder the bite instant is, the less damage is actually being done. So usually if you have a dog that is aggressing and is biting a person or a dog, if it's very loud, a lot of energy is being put into making the scene loud and to making a big commotion about it, which means that a lot of energy is not being spent in the actual bite itself. When a dog is truly aggressing, when a dog is truly with the ambition and goal to cause harm, generally speaking, it's quiet because that means that they're putting all of their energy into inflicting pain. Freezing and stiffness in the body is the most complex overt stress signal. That is because it can happen in two contexts. It can happen as a freeze response when adrenaline is being released, and it can also happen as a precursor signal to adrenaline being released. So it happens as a caution stage. And if you're interested in the difference between fear and caution, I did a video on that. It looks like this. I'll link it at the end of this video. But it is misunderstood because it can happen in both contexts. Freezing and staring is often accompanied by a closed mouth, which usually means that the breathing has been impaired. A lot of times because the dog looks stiff, because he is staring off into the abyss, because he's quiet, because his mouth is closed, the common dog owner might look at that and think, okay, well, he's relaxed, he's just looking, he's just staring. In some cases, that's very true. In some cases, the dog is just observing. And so that's one of the things that makes this particularly overt stress signal very complex, very complicated, very hard for the common dog owner to understand, is just because it can happen in these many different circumstances. Okay, so now I have given you the factual observable parts of these dog behaviors. Now I'm going to interject more subjectivity. Some of this is my personal opinion, but most of it is the consensus within the educated community, that even though these are hypotheses, they're pretty educated, pretty agreed upon hypotheses. And so that's what we're going to talk about right now. So the piloerection, or the hair sticking up on the hackles, that tends to happen stereotypically in larger breeds. It can happen within all breeds, but it stereotypically happens within larger breeds, and it happens as a byproduct of hyperarousal. So one of the things that is confusing about this is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the dog is fearful, or that the dog is scared, or that the dog is angry about something. It literally just means that the brain is overstimulated, and more specifically, it means that the body is flexing. It means that the muscles are tensing, but that can happen for a lot of different reasons, including happiness. You take a dog to a dog park and the dog might become very happy, very silly, which can cause the muscles to flex, which can cause the piloerection. So we want to make sure that we are thinking in terms of excitability with this particular behavior, not necessarily an emotion, not necessarily like happiness or anger. Peeing and defecation is the most misunderstood stress signal, in my opinion. A lot of times people will have a dog with separation anxiety who pees every time they leave, and they think that that means that the dog is, somehow spiteful or disrespectful, or is doing it just to make you mad. There has been absolutely no evidence to indicate that dogs experience spite. I'm not saying it can't be proven in the future. I'm just saying that there are emotions absolutely that have been proven within a dog. Spite is not one of those. So to say that your dog is displaying spite doesn't make sense at all, particularly when we know that adrenaline has the effect of turning off these other systems like we talked about before. When we know that the more automatic systems that work tend to become impaired, tend to start functioning oddly when adrenaline is being released and the body does this shift, it makes sense that, of course, the dog is going to start peeing or defecating when they're stressed, because they're no longer functioning in a healthy way. In my experience, the lunging from a dog usually happens because of poor handling techniques. It can happen for other reasons. I don't want to discount that, but stereotypically, lunging on the leash happens because the owner has poor handling techniques. And I'm not going to cover all of those handling techniques right now, but I definitely recommend that you check out Grisha Stewart. She's got a YouTube channel, and she's got a couple of wonderful handling techniques with leash handling and things like that. So I will link that in the description box below if you're interested in checking that out. In my humble opinion, and in the opinion of many educated folk, snarling, growling, air nipping, all of those things are the best motor patterns that dogs come equipped with. And that is because they are actively warning the stimulus. They're actively warning who they perceive as a threat, that things are escalating and that they don't want to have to aggress, but that they will if things continue getting out of hand. So when a dog is growling at you or snarling at you, they are giving you the opportunity to bow out. They are saying, look, homie, I don't want to have a fight with you right now. Please don't push me to this limit. If you continue doing this, things are going to get sour. And I consider it courteous when a dog gives me those signals. I go, thanks for the warning. I don't feel like losing a finger today, and you just helped a sister out. We cannot be punishing those signals. You do not want to punish a growl. You do not want to punish a snarl. You do not want to tell the dog that they are bad when they do that, because what ends up happening is you get rid of the snarl, you get rid of the growl, you get rid of these warning signals, but the bite is still going to happen. And the only difference is now the bite is going to happen by surprise, and you're not going to necessarily get a warning before it happens. So if you want to be told, hey, you're about to lose a finger, don't keep doing that, keep the snarl around, because it's going to help you in the long run. Now, biting is a worst case scenario for dogs. We do know that, as we talked about before, it's hazard avoidance. And so if the dog has put themselves in a biting situation where they felt like they needed to do so, they now feel like they can no longer avoid hazard. They feel like they must respond. Within the biting scale, we have a couple of different degrees of biting. I'm not going to get into that here because I don't think that that's pertinent right now, but we know that dogs really conserve the amount of damage that they do. I can't stress to you enough that when you have a dog that's biting, first of all, you need to help that dog. But secondly, be sympathetic for that dog. Understand that they did not want to do that. They did not want to have to be put in that position. It's incredibly taxing on the body. It is the equivalent to you getting in a really bad car wreck and barely walking out alive, and then the very next day you have to get back in a car again. And imagine how stressful that would be. Imagine how uncomfortable that would be to go in a really awful car crash, barely walk out alive, but then the very next day and for the rest of your life, you still have to live in cars. Stiffness in the body is probably the most overlooked behavior. As we talked about before, it can happen in a lot of different phases. Stiffness in the body is one of the things that I see most commonly, ironically. Even though it is one of the most complex parts of stress, it is also the most common used by dogs. You're gonna see that tension, you're gonna see the body flex, you're gonna see them probably close their mouth, they're gonna stare, they're gonna orient, their ears are gonna probably go straight forward. They might even go glued back if they're asking for an appeasing behavior. We'll talk about appeasing behaviors in part 3. But we know that that tension in the body also impairs their ability to breathe well. So when I see a dog going through that, I know that's not a dog I can interact with, because it's not safe for me to interact with another species who isn't breathing well. Breathing is the first fundamental thing that every species needs to do in order to do everything else. If that dog isn't getting that, his ability to think reasonably and to have a healthy interaction with me is being dramatically impaired. So what I would say when you're looking at your own dog, but especially when you're looking at a stranger's dog who's doing this, is you need to think to yourself, how well is he breathing right now? Look at the abdomen. Yes, you're going to see tension in the body. Yes, you're going to see stiffness, but you actually want to look at his rib cage to see how well is he breathing. And can I get more fluidity throughout his body in order for him to start breathing well? Now, calming signals sound like kind of a good thing, but they actually happen as a result of stress. Specifically, why we call them calming signals is because the dog is trying to calm themselves. You want to think of it kind of like a stress ball for humans, right? The idea is that they are channeling that stress, channeling that tension, and putting it into a healthier solution in lieu of aggression. Calming signals commonly happen before the dog goes over threshold. They can happen while the dog is over threshold as well, but you are more likely to see these as precursor signals. I think that calming signals are the most overlooked behaviors, but they are also the most informative. And once you know what to look for, you can prevent your dog from going over threshold in the first place. So calming signals actually originally started with a woman named Turid Regaw, who I'm going to link her website in the description box below. She's a wonderful resource. She does have a book. It's a very small book. And if you are looking for a much more in-depth analysis of dog body language, particularly as it pertains to stress, I highly recommend you look into getting that book. Turid Regaw is a wonderful resource, and I can't speak highly enough about that book. We want to think in terms of the objective of the dog when he's going through these calming signals is hazard avoidance, like we spoke about in the first video, and this is meant to de-escalate tension. It is meant to release tension. That is why we call them calming signals. So some common calming signals that you may find are the lip lick, a yawn, teeth clacking, heavy scanning, the shake off, sniffing the ground, turning the head away, and panting or heavy breathing. The lip lick tends to happen on top of the nose. It tends to, as opposed to going across the face, and it tends to be very fast. It's not usually like a big like clean up the face moment. It is fast and quick and on top of the nose. The yawn tends to happen with the eyes closed. It tends to happen with a sound. They usually go, right? And they usually close their eyes and it's very big and dramatic. Teeth clacking is less common and it usually happens with heavy scanning. Heavy scanning results when the dog is looking in a lot of places but isn't actually seeing. So you may see him moving his head a whole lot, but he's not actually taking in information. The shake off resembles when a dog is wet and they actually shake off that, wet dog behavior, but they'll do this when they're perfectly dry. It usually happens right after a tense moment. So the dog has been holding on to a lot of tension, has been stiff like we talked about in the first video, and now they're going to shake it all off. Turning the head away is when the dog looks into a different direction than the stimulus. This is usually indicative of disinterest, but it also requires an amount of trust. It requires the dog to be particularly vulnerable. Anytime that a dog turns their back to a stimulus, they're at least to some degree trusting that the stimulus isn't going to come charging at them. Panting and heavy breathing results as a byproduct of escalated heart rate. It is fairly common. Okay, so now we have talked about the behaviors in the most objective way. Now I'm going to start giving you a little bit more insight into what these behaviors mean. And remember, this is all subjective. This does tend to be the consensus around the educated community, but I think it's important that you know that there's a difference between what we know for certain and what we speculate. And what I'm about to tell you are just things that we speculate based off of education. So the lip lick usually indicates a lack of confidence. That doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. For example, if I'm teaching a new puppy to sit and they give me a lip lick, or if I'm teaching a new dog to walk nicely on the leash and they give me a lip lick, that doesn't necessarily mean, all hell's about to freeze over. It doesn't necessarily mean everything is about to come undone. It just indicates to me that the dog is showing me I don't completely feel like I have all the information. I feel like I still have questions. So, for example, if you're in the middle of a training session and your dog gives you that lip lick, as opposed to a lip lick that has to do with the Pavlovian response to food, that's different. But if it's about stress, if it's about a calming signal, it's that quick up on the nose, fast, then it's usually indicative of a dog that's just saying, I'm not ready to move forward because I don't feel like I have a solid foundation on what we're even doing right now. So if you start to raise the criteria when they're demonstrating that, then likely it's all gonna fall apart because he just told you he still has questions at this degree. So the yawn and the teeth clacking are usually indicative of, hey, this is getting harder. I don't know much longer I can take this. The teeth clacking is less common. Not very many dogs do it, but it usually goes like, right? It's usually indication that this is really getting much more stressful and we need to de-escalate this situation. We need to lower the criteria of the environment. The shake off is a way for the dog to say, oh my God, God, that's over. Let's not do that again. That was really tense. Personally, I like the shake off. Personally, I look for it. It is a healthy way for a dog to cope with stress. We encourage that. However, it's still a stress signal. It's still the dog telling you that this was really challenging and that caused a lot of tension. So the shake off will usually lead next into panting and breathing heavy. But the one thing that I will tell you about panting is that because it just means that the heart rate is higher, that can happen for so many different reasons. I mean, anything can raise the heart rate. So panting alone doesn't usually tell me specifically how stressed the dog is. It aids, it gives me a hint. It's one of the things that I first look for, but alone on its own, panting isn't a very reliable source to tell you how stressed your dog is. You have to look at these other contexts. You have to look for these other calming signals or stress signals in order for you to really know what the dog is experiencing and how stressed they actually are. Turning the dog's head away or having him disengage, having the dog look in a different direction than the stimulus is another healthy way of disengaging, of telling the stimulus, hey, I want you to stay over there. I don't really want you to approach over here. If you stay over there, we're chill. But if you come closer or if I have to engage with you, then that'll be much more difficult. Usually when dogs turn their heads away or disengage, they also resolve to sniffing. That's very common. Sniffing is a wonderful way to lower the heart rate. I encourage it. I think it's wonderful. One thing that I encourage people to recognize though is that just because the dog's nose is on the ground in one spot doesn't necessarily mean they're thinking about that spot. Often the dogs will turn their heads away and put their nose over here, but they're actually sniffing far away. So you can think of that like when you're eavesdropping at the restaurant, you know, you might hear a conversation behind you. You're gonna look ahead and you're not gonna look at the conversation, but you're definitely listening to it. That's commonly what ends up happening with sniffing. If you see a dog doing this where they're not paying attention to you, do not approach them, do not engage with them, leave them alone. And if your dog is disengaging from the stimulus, is looking away from the stimulus, be your dog's voice if a person starts approaching or if a dog starts approaching them, to stand up and say, hey, my dog doesn't necessarily want that right now. They're doing their thing, maybe another time. Appeasing behaviors generally occur when the dog is not over threshold. That is, that the adrenaline has not been released. In fact, usually appeasing behaviors can happen when the dog is not even remotely near going over threshold. And that is a very, very, very mild level of stress. The best way to think about appeasing behaviors is that the dog is going to try to make themselves small and non-confrontational in some capacity so that they don't look like they are trying to confront the stimulus or cause a problem. This all goes back to what we were talking about in the first two videos, which is hazard avoidance. Remember that dog behavior exists to avoid death. And quite frankly, that's why appeasing behaviors exist, to minimize a situation, to take something that could be viewed as confrontational, as disrespectful, and go, haha, just kidding, sorry, apologize. Let me not get in the middle of that. Under the category of appeasing behaviors, we have two subcategories, one of those being active and the other being deferential. Deferential is also commonly called passive, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to call it deferential. Active appeasing behaviors tend to be stereotyped as silly, submissive, playful, nice, gentle. Deferential behaviors tend to be stereotyped as dominant or mean or rude or even sometimes aggressive. But again, I can't stress enough, when it comes to behavior, we do not attach emotions just yet. We talk about observable behaviors, we talk about it in very objective terms, and that's what we're gonna start off with right now. Let's start off with active behaviors. Now, active behaviors include nuzzling and licking. These can be attention-seeking behaviors that the dogs do to get the person or the other dog to pay attention to them. It's often a way to indicate that they want to play. Walking in a curve or standing in a curve. We call it the banana curve. It is a way for the dog to make himself small. It's a way for him to be less offensive, less oppressive. And dogs use it very commonly when they're initially meeting someone. They do that nose to butt sniff. They walk around in circles and they make themselves kind of like a banana. That's the banana curve. The play bow is often used as an appeasing behavior. It's usually commonly displayed after the dog has just like tackled something, or maybe they pawed at something and then they're gonna try to revert back and make themselves small. As far as my opinions on those, the nuzzling and the licking tend to exist in more codependent dogs. Not to say that codependency is a bad thing inherently, but there needs to be balance. And I found that a lot of times when I'm dealing with the dog with separation anxiety, for example, they display a lot of this nuzzling, a lot of this licking, a lot of the pawing at the person, and these can be needy, clingy behaviors. Very commonly, the pawing or the nuzzling or the licking occurs when the dog is looking for coddling, and it's not necessarily arriving when the dog is being brave. Again, that is incredibly generalized, and I can't stress to you enough that, you know, everything is contextualized, right? I mean, if a dog is licking you and they're clearly not just doing it because they want attention seeking and because they need to be near you, then licking is not a problem, okay? So don't take what I'm saying out of context. Keep it within the context of stress, keep it within the context of anxiety. The banana curve is one of my personal favorites. My clients will tell you that I love the banana curve. Many times I will train the behavior into dogs. I'll actually teach them how to banana curve because I find that it is a wonderful alternative to jumping. It also is a wonderful way for them to keep their head safe, because when they curve their body into a person, their head is usually away and their belly is next to the person. So you want to think of like, our Staffies tend to do this, our Great Danes tend to do this, where they will lean into the person and provide their abdomen, and then they get those kind of rib cage rubs. That is wonderful behavior. It's very healthy. It's important that when two dogs are meeting each other, they're doing that curve, that there is rotation. That's one of the problems people run into when they're doing on-leash meet and greets. When they have two dogs meeting on leash, they cannot do that curve well because the leashes get tangled, which is one of the reasons so many trainers will say, don't let the dogs meet on leash. In my personal experience, the play bow tends to happen as an apology. It's another way of saying I'm sorry. There will commonly see a lot of like extroverts use this play bow. They will, maybe come on a little strong. They'll go into the dog park, they'll run in, they'll tackle the other dogs, and then they go, oh crap, sorry, just kidding, please be my friend, please love me, and they'll do the play bow. So it's a way for them to correct themselves and go, I didn't mean to come on strong, I really just want to be your friend. Moving right into deferential behaviors. Deferential behaviors tend to happen, again, more as hazard avoidance, but less in the case of like happiness, silliness, and more in the case of like, homie, you're coming on strong right now, things are escalating, this is not a good thing, and I really need space. So deferential would be a little bit different in that, they're really asking for more space as opposed to asking for the other person to engage just to not misunderstand their intent. All of the behaviors that I explained in part 1 of our series are considered deferential. All of these overt stress signals are considered deferential behaviors. Some, and actually many of the calming signals that I explained in part 2 of this series are also deferential behaviors. So I'm going to cover in this part the behaviors that we have not covered in those other 2 videos that are also considered deferential. Averting eye contact is simply the dog moving his eye into a different direction. Usually the head goes with it. Everything just goes into the different direction. The whale eye is a little bit different, in which the dog might move his head, but his eyes stay there. And so one of the reasons we call it the whale eye is because often you're getting, a little bit of black over here, and then you get all of the white. So if I look this way, you can see that there's a lot of white on that side. That's why we call it the whale eye. The difference between a disengage and a whale eye is that a disengage is going to be a little bit more trusting than a whale eye. Remember that when a dog looks away or turns their back on a stimulus, that requires a degree of trust. So if a dog is turning their head away, they're saying, I don't want to engage with you, but I don't trust you enough to not look away. And that's the difference between a whale eye and averting eye contact. Lowering the head and tucking the body and changing the posture a little bit into a scrunch, that is all considered making the dog small. He's doing that on purpose. Just to give a little bit more clarification, one of the reasons dogs do appeasing behaviors is because they want to make themselves small so that they don't appear like a viable threat to the stimulus. So lowering the head and making himself small is a way of saying, see, I'm not that scary. I'm really not that big of a threat. Don't come at me, because see how small I am? It also is demonstrative of a lack of confidence, that they do not feel as though that they would be able to proficiently fight the threat, if it will. And we talked about hazard avoidance. The whole objective with these behaviors is to not get killed, to not get in a fight. And so if a dog is cowering and is making themselves small, they're keenly aware, they're aware that they are not going to be able to win this fight, and so they don't even want to get in the fight because they're going to lose. Laying on the ground and showing the belly when they're not asking for belly rubs. This is different than like a golden retriever or something that's just asking for belly rubs. This is different. But laying on the floor and offering a belly is a submissive behavior, and it is another way of making the dog small. So now let me give you the educated consensus, the hypotheses of what these mean, the more emotional subjective element of these behaviors. Starting off with the whale eye. The whale eye, in my experience and in the experience of many people, is that the whale eye is very dangerous. And if you have a dog who's demonstrating a whale eye, this is usually accompanied by a snarl, or it's usually accompanied by some more aggressive behavior. And I can't stress to you enough that if you see this, you really need to back away. You need to disengage. You need to understand that this is a courtesy that the dog is giving you, that telling you that things are escalating. And if you have more questions about that, check out part 1 of this series, because I talk about these courtesies that dogs do to tell you that things are escalating. Moving on to when the dog cowers or make themselves small. Many times people perceive these behaviors as guilt, where the person will walk in and give a harsh tone and the dog will kind of make themselves small and say, "I'm sorry." People will perceive it as guilt. Now, there is absolutely conflicting information on whether or not dogs experience guilt. Some evidence has said that it does not exist, and then there's been other studies that have pointed out flaws in those prior studies and have said that, well, we need more information, we don't really know. Personally, until I see wholehearted proof that guilt exists, I'm going to believe it doesn't within the dog. I'm not going to insinuate that a dog has an emotion without actually knowing for sure that it does. So I am just going to say it doesn't have guilt. And more likely when a dog is displaying these behaviors, they're understanding that the person or the stimulus in the space is somehow confrontational, somehow upset with them, and they're trying to de-escalate the situation. Now, they could know this for a number of reasons. They could know this based off of body language. Dogs are incredibly intuitive to human body language. That has been proven. But more specifically, they can smell it. When you are frustrated, when you are upset, when you are stressed, you are emitting a pheromone that dogs can smell. Dogs can smell pheromones, people cannot. So when you are experiencing that emotion of, oh my God, my dog did X, you are literally emitting a pheromone that the dog smells on you. Your dog is understanding that there is a degree of stress in the space and that stress needs to be de-escalated in order to avoid hazard. So they put on this, I'm innocent, I'm small, please don't hurt me, in order to prevent confrontation. Displacement behaviors are commonly displayed when the dog is approaching threshold, but they can also be displayed early on in the mild discomfort stages. Very common to calming signals, which we discussed in part 2, these behaviors tend to be confusing for the common dog owner because they can occur at many different phases in the stress sequence. They can occur at many different points, and it's important that you individualize it to your dog. So to begin with, I want you to think of the displacement behavior like the kid in the class who's giving his very first presentation. The example I always use is you've got a 4th grader who's giving his first class presentation. What he typically might do is glue himself to the board and talk really fast and look everywhere else, and his hands start palming and he kind of like this, and it's very awkward and it's weird. They are behaviors that a person might display that are out of context, and the only reason they're giving those behaviors is because they're uncomfortable or stressed or overwhelmed. Now, in part 2 and part 3, where we talked about appeasing behaviors and calming signals, there were some examples of displacement behaviors in there. Some of it being the play bow, the shake, the yawn, laying on the ground and offering a belly rub. These are all things that dogs will do that are out of context, that are unusual for the situation. So if you don't know about those couple of behaviors, recommend you check out those videos. Today we are going to talk about the behaviors that I haven't spoken about yet that are considered displacement behaviors as well. So some examples of displacement behaviors include scratching, sneezing, biting paws or another body part, jumping up on you, and having an awkward standing position. Scratching and sneezing are ways for the dogs to release tension from the body. It is a way to release oxygen effectively. You can think of it as a release of tension, very similar to the shake off. Biting paws or another body part is indicative of a compulsive behavior. It tends to happen on autopilot, and if not treated, it actually can cause a lot of physical harm as well. Dogs can get very injured by mauling themselves. Jumping on the owner often occurs as a flight response or when the dog feels clueless. So a lot of times the dog might have a question and say, I don't know what what I'm supposed to be doing, so they turn to a trustworthy source. Awkward standing positions can result in the dog looking like a square or looking like a triangle, but more specifically, it tends to look when the dog's standing position is just like literally the paws are placed in a weird spot. So literally, like, instead of having them even 1 and 2, you might have like 1 and 2, right? And those are like the paws are just looking weird. In a standing position, you might also notice that the dog is not exactly level. You may notice that his hind legs look taller than his front legs. Let's start graduating into the more subjective behaviors, what you not necessarily can't see, but what we speculate to be going on. Starting off with the scratch. When we have a dog that is scratching their ear or scratching their neck, for example, a lot of times owners overlook this one. This is a very commonly overlooked behavior that we deem as, well, the dog had an itch, or the dog needed, the collar was scratching him, or very commonly, my dog doesn't usually wear collars, so now he's scratching for that. That is entirely possible. It is, like, absolutely, okay? But if you're seeing these other stress signals, if you're seeing where the dog is maybe doing some appeasing behaviors, or maybe he's also giving some lip licks, or maybe he's also doing some of these other stress signals that we've talked about in the other videos, and he's scratching his ear, this is a uncomfortable situation for him. He is awkward and he is feeling a little bit clueless. Biting paws and self-mutilation, in my experience, is a much more severe case of anxiety. I've seen it where most times when I see that, the dog is dealing with anxiety, not just fear. Dogs can get seriously hurt by them just chewing themselves to death. And we need to make sure that we are aware that that very commonly is a higher level of mental health disorder that needs intervention. When a dog jumps on the owner, this is usually deemed as a bad thing worth correcting, or potentially it's even rewarded with a yes, because, you know, maybe they give you eye contact or something, and sometimes it's just cute and the person likes it. Neither of those should really happen. We are looking for opportunities for the dog to be brave, and generally speaking, when the dog is jumping up on you, that is demonstrating to you that they aren't necessarily feeling very brave. That being said, when a dog jumps up on you, they're also saying, I don't know what else I should be doing. So tell the dog what else they should be doing, right? If they're looking at you going, I'm clueless, I need help, here, walk me through this process, do exactly that. You don't necessarily need to reward the jump. Just tell them what they should be doing instead. Help a sister out, right? It's not that you are correcting the jump. It's not that you're saying no, bad dog. And it's not that you are necessarily saying yes, good dog. It's that you're saying, I want you to do something else instead. This is what you should be giving alternatively. Personally, displacement behaviors are one of my favorite things to study up on, to learn, just because they can come in such a wide variety. Displacement behaviors are the epitome of context changing everything. When you change the context, when you change the situation of the behavior changes everything. So displacement behaviors are, in my experience, one of the most useful tools that dogs give us to have insight into how they're feeling. With that said, they're also very complicated for the common dog owner. And, you know, if you just message me on Instagram right now and say, hey, my dog, you know, mauls his foot, do you think that means that he's anxious? I don't know. How would I ever know that? Because the thing is it depends on the context. I need way more information, because he very well could be just chewing on his foot because his nails are long. I mean, how am I supposed to know? And the same goes for something like a play bow. If it goes, well, my dog play bows at me every single time that he gets out of the crate, do you think that means that he's stressed or that he's apologizing? Well, no. I mean, if he was in the crate and he was just sleeping, probably the play bow is acting as a stretch, right? And he's probably just waking up. So the context of the situation changes everything. And that's one of the reasons why having more insight will help you, because you'll be able to see something and go, okay, you know what? Yes, she does this commonly, but she also is in this situation with that stimulus, and she's given me a lip lick, and she's yawning, and she's looking for a flight response. So that tells me that this play bow or this whatever that she just did is a stress signal. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit like and subscribe, and I'll see y'all soon.